Good evening and welcome to the third of the Ian Ramsey Centre seminars for Trinity Term 2012. This evening I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Helen De Cruz, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Research Foundation Flanders. She holds PhD degrees in archaeology and in philosophy, and her research at Somerville College is supported by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation. She's working on a project entitled Cognitive Origins of Intuitions in Natural Theology, which is exploring the implications of the cognitive scientific literature for natural theological arguments. This evening she'll be talking on the argument from miracles and the cognitive science of religious testimony. Please would you welcome Dr. Helen De Cruz.
I'd like to start out by thanking Andrew very much for inviting me here. So I want to start out by giving you a little bit of context. I do not have a watch or anything, so if I go over time, you do have to tell me. This is part of a book project that Johan de Smet, who is also a philosopher, and I am writing. And so this is one of the chapters, and we'll be talking about the implications of the cognitive science of religion for the argument from miracles. So the argument from miracles is quite a peculiar argument if you look at natural theological arguments. And natural theological arguments are just arguments that are not based on scripture or revelation, but that are based on reason and experience. So there are quite some differences with other natural theological arguments. And most importantly, I think, is that the argument from miracles aims not to just establish that there is a God, but more specifically, that a specific religious doctrine is true. In particular, Christianity. There's also other arguments for miracles, but I will concentrate here on the Christian argument for miracles. And that argument basically says because there are miracles, healing miracles, more specifically, the miracle of the resurrection, that Christianity is true. So you see that this argument relies to a great extent on historical evidence, so on empirical evidence. Now, other natural theological arguments do that to some extent. For instance, the cosmological argument says there is a universe and therefore God exists. Of course, it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's the baseline. But basically, there is a universe. It's not very specific. So here it's a specific historical event. And also, for reasons that I will go into more later, the argument for miracles is usually not treated as a standalone argument, but as a cumulative case. And as Mill already observed, if we don't already believe in supernatural agencies, no miracle can prove to us their existence. Nothing can ever prove that it is a miracle, because there is always an alternative naturalistic explanation that you could offer. Now, currently, the argument for miracles seems to be in a pretty bad shape. And the main reason for that is Hume. So I'll go into that in a moment. But so I looked a bit around, for instance, in the Phil papers list, which is this huge database of philosophical papers. And here are the categories of religious arguments. So these are the categories. And you see here the number of papers that are listed in the Phil papers database. And you see here that the argument for miracles in the past 50 years or so has only had like 15 papers that the Phil papers people found worth including in their database. So less philosophical attention for the argument for miracles as opposed to other arguments. Also, I did a survey not so long ago, which several of you have filled out, for which I'm very grateful. And I asked, so I gave 8 positive religious arguments and 8 negative ones, and asked which ones how strong do you find them? And as you can see, here is the mean score. And you see here that the argument for miracles is rated as the weakest of 16 arguments. So after the pragmatic argument and the argument from beauty, even like it's the weakest possible argument. So why is this so? So these are 802 respondents. So this gives pretty good senses, I think, of what philosophers think today. Well, this is the culprit, I think. Hume, in his essay of miracles, which is included in his inquiry, argued quite basically that it's never reasonable to accept the testimony to miracles. And generally, we have come to regard, at least in philosophy, Hume as this sort of, this is the definite nail in the coffin to the argument for miracles. It's seen as, this is how you have to write philosophical essays. It's included in anthologies. But the problem is that this kind of showcase status that Hume's essay has gotten gives us the mistaken impression that Hume sort of simultaneously raised up the argument for miracles than just to cut it down again. Whereas actually that debate has been going on for a long time, and Burns actually puts Hume's essay at the tail end rather than the vanguard of this debate. And actually Hume was a bit unhappy that his essay didn't get the hoped impact that he thought it would have. Well, it did get that later, but not at the time actually. But the interesting thing is that actually historically the argument for miracles is really important. So historically it had a central apologetic function. So for instance, if you read Paul, in particular 1 Corinthians, the acceptance of the central Christian miracle is essential for Christianity. He says, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our proclamation has been in vain and your faith has been in vain. And then he says some more, even we have to be pitied even to, and also we're giving false testimony. So if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. And this central apologetic function remained until well into the 18th century. So these are actually the preliminary reasons why I've just sketched this, is even though the argument for miracles now is not considered an important natural theological argument, it has historically an apologetic role. And that makes it interesting to look at from the cognitive perspective. So there has been some philosophical literature on miracles. And what are the main questions? These questions are interrelated, as we'll see. First question is, what do we actually mean by a miracle? And is that a coherent notion? The second question is, under which, if any circumstances, can we accept the testimony to miraculous events? And the final question, can the testimony of miracles be used to argue for the truth of particular religious beliefs? Now, as you will probably see, if you examining these three questions, if you give positive answers to each of them, then you get sort of claims of increasing strength. So, of course, obviously, if you have an incoherent notion, then, well, you have nothing to start out with. And similarly, if it's never acceptable to believe testimony of miracles, well, how can you ever then even start using it to argue for particular religious beliefs? So what I'll do now tonight is look at these from the perspective of cognitive science. So first I'll look at what cognitive scientists have to say about the semantic question. So how do people intuitively conceive of miracles? Then the epistemic question, can the cognitive science of testimony shed new light on the reasonableness of accepting testimony to miracles? And then I'll say a little bit at the end about the argumentative question of whether or not the cognitive science of testimony can support the argument for miracles. So actually, I think that the conception of miracles that you're all most familiar with is the Humean one. The Hume just defines miracles as events that occur by the volition of God or some other supernatural being, which violate the laws of nature. And this is a very widespread definition, widespread in contemporary philosophy of religion. For instance, Swinburne takes this, so he says something like a miracle is a violation of laws of nature by a god, for instance. However, this is a bit puzzling, because actually, the moment that, for instance, Paul writes about miracles, this concept of law of nature did not exist. So how do we have to look at this historically? Well, it's interesting to note that, for instance, Augustine had a subjectivist concept of miracle. It's useful to look at the etymology. Miracle comes from mirare. I don't speak Latin, so I hope that's the correct stress. So that's a transitive verb, to be amazed at something, to marvel at something. And so he simply calls it in a letter to a Manichaean friend, a miracle is something strange and difficult which exceeds the expectation and capacity of him who marvels at it. So, and next to that, in the City of God, he also calls it an uncommon event. Now he says it's just the uncommonness that makes something a miracle, because actually, for instance, Augustine said we don't understand why the seasons change. So actually that would just be so as miraculous to us if all of a sudden seasons changed and they didn't do that before. But because they do it, we sort of get used to it. So it's not contrary to nature, but rather to our knowledge of nature. The problem with this subjectivist account is that there are no clear accounts on what is a miracle. So the problem is a bit, that's probably why Aquinas wanted to put miracles as a sort of more objective view. And accordingly, a miracle is an action that goes beyond the inherent powers of created substances. So, for instance, if an angel does something that we couldn't do, then it's not really a miracle because it lies within the powers of the created substance of the angel. So a miracle is also, according to Aquinas, not contrary to nature, because it's just God who chooses to work in a way that is different from what nature is accustomed to. So when did this Humean concept emerge? Actually in the 17th century. So accordingly, miracles are violations of the laws of nature. And that actually, of course, emerged, well, if you don't have laws of nature, then you can't also violate them. So the concept of law of nature emerged in the 17th century. And so according to these authors like Boyle, Wilkins, Newton, you had, within the uniformity of nature, exceptional events brought about by God to point to the truth of religious beliefs. But here we reach a problem, because that gives us quite an unstable concept of miracles. Because on the one hand, you have the uniformity of nature and events and laws that just always uniformly hold. And then you have this concept of miracle, which is parasitic on this concept of immutable and stable laws of nature. And at the same time, it seems to subvert the very concept of law of nature. And so this view, as it came to get established in the 17th century, miracles as a violation of law of nature has consequences for how miracles are evaluated. So Hume, for instance, says that, of course, there's a huge Hume scholarship on what exactly he means. But so one interpretation is laws of nature are contingently true generalizations that we generalize through experience. After all, he was an empiricist. So miracles are contrary to our inductive probability, and so the probability that they occur is always very low. And Flew even went further. He said, well, laws of nature are in principle exceptionless, so the notion of miracle is incoherent. And then we get this whole idea about how can we talk about subverting laws of nature if laws of nature are things that are in principle never subverted. Nevertheless, even in the 17th century, you had authors like Clarke, for instance, who said that it's only usualness or unusualness that makes a distinction. So not everybody followed this kind of law-based account. And of course we have Tillich, who clearly states, I mean, for Tillich, a miracle is a sign event, so he goes back to the New Testamentic and especially Johannine conception of miracles as sign events. So these are just extraordinary events that have a shaking and transforming power. And actually, indeed, many people use it in that sense. So they say, oh, the birth of my baby is a miracle. And of course, I mean, it's not a miracle in a kind of law-based way, but it's a shaking and transforming power over those people who witness these events. And that kind of concept, this kind of subjective concept, doesn't suffer the instability. However, we might want to say maybe that's still quite subjectivist, because, I mean, what is a miracle is just whatever you feel to be a miracle. So an alternative approach, based on cognitive science of religion, says that actually our assessment of usualness or unusualness is not a purely subjective matter, because human cognition is constrained by what we've termed intuitive ontologies. So these are just intuitive expectations of how the world will behave. And interestingly, even young infants, for instance, will think that, for instance, you have solid objects, and the solid objects just don't, fall apart for no reason, or if something is occluded, it still exists, and that sort of stuff. So these are the kinds of expectations we have about the world around us. So a miracle could be one of the ways that you could conceptualize a miracle is that it is a violation of intuitive ontological expectations. So let's look, for instance, at the idea of resurrection. Now, there have been a few studies on how we conceptualize death. And Barrett and Binet, this is not Justin Barrett, but H. Clark Barrett, did studies in Germany and with the Shuar, which are South American hunter-gatherers. And he found that actually at 4 years of age, children have this idea that death is a permanent cessation of agency. So for instance, so these were 4-year-old children, and they were shown an animal which was actually a sort of stuffed animal, but anyway, it looks quite realistic. And to some they said, this animal is asleep, and to other ones they said, a hunter killed it. And then they asked all sorts of questions about, will this animal still eat? Will this animal still get up? And so 4-year-olds start realizing that the sleeping animal will still get up after a while and will eat after a while, and that the dead animal will not do that. And so even in the Bering and Bjorklund study, it's quite an interesting study. So that study was, you have a puppet, a crocodile puppet, and you have a mouse puppet. And the crocodile puppet eats the mouse puppet. And then they ask, okay, this mouse, will he ever get up again? Or will he ever become alive again? And even 4-year-olds say no. Now, interestingly, 4-year-olds do think that the mouse will still feel sad. So some psychological properties still exist. But biological properties like eating and drinking, even 4-year-olds, 90% of them also say that this mouse will not eat or drink anymore. So young children believe that death is permanent and irreversible. So Hume said, for instance, that it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life because it has never been observed in any age or country. But of course, 4-year-olds don't go thinking about, okay, this person didn't go alive again and that person didn't go alive again. It is actually a miracle because it violates our intuitive ontology of biology, so in this subjectivist sense. And H. Clark Barrett thinks that one reason that we have this idea of death as a cessation of agency is because humans have been hunters for a long time, might be useful, also prey animals for a long time, to have this distinction between life and death. So if we now look at miracles as this kind of intuitive ontology violating events, then we can actually look at how do people think about miracles and how do they transmit them. Now, Pascal Boyer, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, is a cognitive anthropologist, and he wrote in the 1990s and in 2001, he wrote some books. One of them is called Explaining Religion, or Religion Explained, forgot the exact title. And what he's interested in is not so much how do we come up with new religious concepts, because most of us actually don't come up with new religious concepts. Most of us just take the religious concepts of our parents and so forth. So he's interested in why do religious concepts get transmitted. Now, there might be all sorts of reasons why I would transmit some information to you, or why you would choose to transmit information from your parents. But one factor of transmission success is memorability. So all things being equal, no matter how interesting or true or whatever a claim is, if it's not memorable, it's not going to be transmitted. So Boyer says one reason that we have so many religious ideas is that they have something that makes them particularly memorable. And what makes them memorable is actually something that people have often observed about religious ideas. They're a bit weird. So they violate our intuitive expectations, the expectations that I just talked about. So that makes them, but they don't do that too massively. So they are interesting. They have a cognitive optimum. For instance, you have these kind of human-animal hybrids in lots of god concepts, like, for instance, the Egyptian god Anubis. So they are interesting, and they are not too challenging to represent. I'm just going to give a few examples of this. For instance, the concept of ghost is something you have across cultures. A ghost conforms to intuitive psychology, but violates our intuitive physics by going through walls. So that's very interesting. The interesting thing about this, you don't have to say, look, this ghost is just like other people. It can become angry, you can talk to him, etc. Or this female ghost, actually. But you don't have to say all those stuff. You just have to say a ghost is a person who walks through walls. And then it's quite clear that that's what ghosts do. And you fill out all the things that are normal and intuitive, you sort of fill them out. And so conversely, a zombie conforms to intuitive physics. So zombies don't grow through walls, but they have a bit of a weird intuitive psychology, and the only reasonable social intercourse you can have with the zombies that are trying to eat you. So that's interesting and arresting. So if we look then at miracle stories, I'm going to present these two stories to you. The first story is that there was a wedding party, the host ran out of wine, the guests drank water for the remainder of the party. End of story. Second story, there was a wedding party, the host ran out of wine, one of the guests turned water into wine, people drank wine for the remainder of the party. Now, of course, you're not a sort of blank slate audience, but actually experiments like this have shown that even if you hadn't known this story, you would have found the second story more memorable than the first story, which is actually kind of strange because the second story is longer. If anything, you should forget it sooner. There is a lot of cross-cultural support for the view that this minimally counterintuitive information, so this kind of information that minimally violates our expectations, is very memorable. So you see here, for instance, some graphs where the dark bar is the minimally counterintuitive and the white bar is just bizarre, or wait, am I wrong? No. So here you have bizarre and here you have counterintuitive. And you see here that bizarre, this is immediate recall. And here you have accurate recall, and here you have then counterintuitive. So you see that the counterintuitive is recalled more accurately and also more recalled at all. Sorry about that. So we now see why miracle stories get transmitted successfully. However, we haven't actually seen why people would believe these stories. So that's the so-called Mickey Mouse problem in cognitive science of religion. So people do not worship Mickey Mouse. And similarly, we do not come to believe, for instance, you have the story of the pumpkin turning into a carriage. It's a very interesting story, and it's actually one reason why this story gets transmitted so well, why fairy tales get transmitted so well. But we don't really, so this doesn't really explain why people believe, or sometimes believe, miracles, but don't believe in the pumpkin story. So I think that it's important at this point to make a distinction between content biases and context biases. And this is an important distinction in cognitive science of religion. Content biases are biases that have to do with what the information looks like, how attractive it is, how remember-worthy it is. Whereas context biases have to do with the people who give you the information. So here, for instance, you have the perceived reliability of the witnesses, the context in which the testimony is given. So I'll now skip to the epistemology of testimony. And this is actually an evolutionary puzzle. So actually most of the information, the factual information that you know, comes not through own observation, but through testimony. So for instance, who is the new president of France, for instance? You didn't go to the Élysée. No, he's not at the Élysée. Anyway, you didn't go and verify that for yourself. You got that through testimony. You got it through testimony that I would be here tonight, and so forth. So this is an evolutionary puzzle, because why do we rely so much on information by other people? Deception can be evolutionary advantageous. So if you run like computer simulations, then, you know, after a while things go wrong in information transmission, because agents who deceive other agents might be doing better. So you have actually in biology two strategies to deal with this problem of the problem of information that can be corrupted and that can be subverted to use to their own advantage. And one of them is costly signaling. So what happens there is you make the signals so costly that it's actually not worth it to fake, or that a false signaler cannot fake it. For instance, you have peacock, that's a sort of a standard example. Peacocks signal that they are, you know, attractive and healthy to peahens, and they do that with that horrible tail that they have to carry around. And actually, it's not possible to be a sick peacock and have such a nice and healthy tail. And so it is actually a reliable signal because it's costly. The other way of doing it is cheap signaling. So for instance, this is a vervet monkey, and vervet monkeys have these different alarm calls. So they have an eagle call, they have a snake call, and they have a leopard call. So they have all these different calls for different kinds of predators. And it does turn out, so Cheney and Seyfarth, who have done a lot of studies on these vervet monkeys, have shown that if you play a recording where you always, with the same voice, monkey voice, and it's always a wrong signal, that after a while they start ignoring it. So they start to discriminate between reliable and unreliable signalers. So that's the other strategy. So costly signaling or cheap signaling with then monitoring of information. Now, human testimony is very cheap. I mean, you can just hang out at your ideal deli, the best deli in Oxford and that sort of thing. And you don't have to, I mean, you can just put that there. It doesn't cost you much. I can say that I walked on the moon yesterday. So it's quite cheap. So the prediction is that there must be some way that we can distinguish reliable from unreliable signalers. So testimony is a form of social transmission of information involving a testifier and an audience. And one of the things that distinguishes testimony from other things, like, for instance, fairy tales, is that there is an assumption in the social context in which it takes place that what you're saying is true. So, for instance, fairy tales are not, they're tellings, but they're not testimony. And so, Keener has argued, if you look at the New Testament sources and you look at them, the literary style, well, they were at any rate meant to be transmitting information. Not in the way of a biography would be doing now, but they were in what he calls ancient biography. So this is a genre that you had in the ancient world. So they were at any rate meant to be factual. So we can look at this actually as a form of testimony. Now, one of the questions in philosophy, and actually it's a pity, but philosophy of testimony has mainly focused on this question, and it's still unresolved largely, is the question of whether we are entitled to believe testimony without any evidence about the speaker's reliability or not. One position is reductionism. Reductionism says that testimony is an important source of information, but not to the same fundamental extent as, for instance, perception or memory. So we can always just trust our perception and memory. We don't have to think, are my eyes deceiving me? Am I really seeing a glass in front of me and people in front of me? Or could it be an illusion? I don't have to think that, because perception is a fundamental source of warrant. But so testimony is not in that way. You are entitled, according to reductionists, to accept testimony only if you have an appropriate degree of justification for taking that the testifier is credible. So, for instance, if the testifier says something like really strange, then you have all reasons to be skeptical. On the other hand, you have anti-reductionism, and according to anti-reductionists, testimony is a fundamental source of warrant, like memory or perception. So you are, just like you can trust your memory and your perception without, questioning it, you can trust testimony, except, of course, if there are, reasons to think that something is amiss. But prima facie, you are entitled. So here are some quotes. So Hume, in the Same of Miracles essay, defends the reductionist position, and he says the following. As the evidence derived from witnesses and human testimony is founded on past experience, so it varies with the experience. We frequently hesitate concerning the reports of others. We balance the opposite circumstances, which cause any doubt or uncertainty. And when we discover a superiority on any side, we incline to it, but still with a diminution of assurance in proportion to the force of its antagonist. On the other hand, you have Reid, who is the anti-reductionist. He says, it is evident that in the matter of testimony, the balance of human judgment is by nature inclined to the side of belief and turns to that side of itself when there is nothing put in the opposite scale. And then he says that if credulity were the effect of reasoning and experience, we would expect it to grow up and gather strength in the same proportion as reason and experience do. But if it is a gift of nature, as now cognitive scientists would say if it were maturationally natural or innate, well, then we would think it's strongest in childhood and limited and restrained by experience. And he says you only have to look around to see that the last is really the case and not the first. So it's innate. What I find particularly interesting in these early expositions of reductionism and anti-reductionism is that they mix normative and descriptive claims. So Hume says we ought to be critical of testimony, and in fact we are. We frequently hesitate concerning the reports of others. On the other hand, Reid says we trust testimony, and why shouldn't we? It is a gift of nature. And he says there are two principles that tally together. The principle of credulity, so there's a principle of, well, our tendency to believe what people tell us. And there is the principle of veracity, the tendency to actually tell the truth and not be pathological liars. So why is it important that these normative and descriptive claims are mixed? Well, I think here it's important because we acquire a lot of knowledge through testimony. So there is a lot of reliable, there must be something that we're doing right, given that we learn all. Of course, you can be a radical skeptic about testimony, but given that reductionists and anti-reductionists are not, there is something that we're doing right. So it is interesting to know what mechanisms actually lie at the heart of the transmission of information through testimony. So it's interesting to look at that in detail, and there's a lot of research being done on testimony by Paul Harris, who was here in Oxford just a few days ago, where he gave the memorial lecture at St. John's College. And so he has noticed that children rely a lot more on context than on content. So remember, context is what is the person who is testifying. So more on context than on the content in accepting testimony. So, for instance, even 2-year-olds rely less on an informant who was unreliable in the past. And these are sort of studies where you have an experiment, and the experimenter has something that the 2-year-old will know and say, this is a pencil, and then show a variety of things, and then showing something unknown and saying, this is a clicker or something like that. And then you have another experimenter, so the control group, where you have the experimenter who says things like, this is a bottle and that sort of thing. And 2-year-olds know this is in the bottle. And then they get a sort of false choice about which one is the clicker, and they will believe the person who was reliable in the past with the things that they knew. So, in a sense, we do apparently, even from a very early age onward, do some monitoring of the reliability of the informant. And actually, already at 5 years of age, children have this sort of idea about expertise. There is also some content biases. So, for instance, a recent study by Harris indicates that you give children 2 stories and you give them 2 boxes, and there's a box with fictional characters and a box with real characters, and you give them all sorts of stories, and you give, for instance, a picture of a soldier, and you say this was a soldier who fought in the war in the 19th century, etc. Or you say this is a soldier who had a sword that prevented him from dying. And interestingly, even children of 5 or 6 will put that soldier in a fictional box and say, well, this is just so incredible, that's not going to... So this sort of minimally counterintuitive information, if anything, seems to lower people's assessment of the credibility of these stories. So descriptively, however, Reid is still more right than Hume, because there is lots of evidence that children are willing to accept claims that are quite extraordinary, that they are willing to trust testifiers. This is actually not a bad thing, because otherwise we couldn't learn anything if we just believed anything that tallied with our experience. And what's more, this trust in testimony is actually really unique among non-human animals. So there have been comparative studies, which I'll show in the next slide, showing that this reliance on testimony is quite uniquely human. And this is a study, so I don't know if the sound works, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, the sound doesn't work, but I'm just going to, I hope you can see this. So this is research done by Victoria Horner, and I don't know if you can see this, but she approaches some chimpanzees with a machine. Can you actually see it?
Just about.
Just about. Okay, so you see the machine. And then she shows them what to do. So you have to push these, you have to tap it, and then you have to push these kind of tubes through, then you have to poke in the inside of the machine, and only then can you actually use this kind of stick to get out the reward, right? And then she gives the stick to the chimpanzee, and so chimpanzees do what Tomasello calls emulation. So they don't strictly imitate, but they can copy the actions reasonably well. So the chimpanzee does the same thing. He pokes, he puts the tubes to one side, and then he retrieves the reward. Or maybe it's a she. Here you have human children, and so they also get the same thing. So they get no verbal instruction. They just hear, now we're going to play a game, and then they get the same demonstration, and then they tap, they poke. So same procedure, they poke, and then after a while they get the candy. So this is quite fun. Now the second condition is quite interesting. I hope this is visible, because here you see that the box is, this is a see-through version of the same box. And now you can actually see, I hope this is visible, that this isn't achieving anything. You just have a false ceiling. So actually the whole poking and moving doesn't do anything. And actually what you see when the chimpanzee gets, he just doesn't bother with this anymore, with the top part anymore. It goes straight for the reward, because the first part of the action isn't accomplishing anything. And here you have Andrew Whiten, who is the researcher, who says something about. But look, the children, even though they see that there is this false ceiling, that this tapping and moving isn't accomplishing anything, they nevertheless just continue. So this is the trust that people have in this sort of non-verbal testimony. And here they go. This goes on for a while. Now, that seems like irrational. Why would they do that? Well, according to Harris, one of the reasons why we might want to trust testimony is, now you saw the chimpanzee just took a shortcut and didn't bother with the whole poking and stuff. But actually, once technology becomes a bit complex, it might not be a good idea to shortcut. I mean, suppose you have, for instance, you have this Aborigine way of making kind of cake. So you have this kind of poisonous seeds that you have to dry in the sun, and then the poison, so the poisonous substance evaporates, and then you bake it, etc. Suppose the people just said, "Oh, I'm not going to bother with it. I'm just going to eat it." Well, they just get poisoned. So as information becomes more complex, it becomes a good idea to trust testimony. So there are actually three factors that probably play an important role in explaining why, if we have these are tools of 4,300 years ago, and these are tools of today. Whereas chimpanzees, for instance, well, 4,300 years ago, they used these stones to get crack nuts, and that's what they still do today. So they don't trust testimony, they also don't have teaching, they don't have joint attention. So I think that actually, prima facie, it's reasonable to believe testimony, given that on the whole, it seems to give us useful information. I'm not saying that it's also the case for miracles, but it seems to be at least that the anti-reductionist position has better support than the reductionist position. So that still doesn't say much about whether or not believing in miracles is justified, or if we can even use it for an argument. So I'm now going to look at some philosophical positions, and one of them is internalism. So according to internalism, you can accept testimony if it coheres with your worldviews. So this is just internalism, where if beliefs cohere with the beliefs you already have, then you can accept them. And since, of course, theists within their worldview, miracles, some miracles at least, seem to cohere with their worldview, it seems reasonable for them to accept miracles. Of course, if you're a naturalist, then the probability of miracles is vanishingly small. So a theist seems to be entitled to accept testimony to miracles. However, there is a sort of interdependence going on, the interdependence that I talked about in the beginning of the lecture, that Mill talked about. It's because you already accept that we live in a world where miracles are possible, that you grant that testimony to miracles is reliable, and so this sort of coheres very well. But the problem is that you can't really get people who don't already believe in theism to get into this sort of loop of miracles cohering with theism. So it doesn't provide fruitful grounds for an argument for miracles. Now, of course, maybe it could be that there are some events that are of such quality, you know, like stars in the sky, doing a Bible verse or something like that, that even people who don't have a worldview that coheres with it allows for it. But I don't think so. I'm just going to show you this nice video. I hope it works. Or maybe it doesn't. Ah, right. So this is, I don't know if you heard about this, about the milk drinking statue miracles. And yeah, so I don't know if this is visible, but this is quite a spectacular event. This was in Hindu temples, so it started out somewhere, I forgot where it started out. But anyway, it spread around Hindu communities quite quickly. Ah, yes, there it says. Hindu temples, people offer milk to statues often there, because so pouring milk over statues is not so unusual. But in 1995, miraculously, all sorts of statues started drinking milk. There are, of course, scientific explanations for this, like the capillary effect of the statues. But so nevertheless, it seems to me that non-Hindus were not convinced by this miracle. And this is already observed. 18th century author Campbell already said that actually miracles that don't cohere with your worldview, people aren't going to be convinced by them. Yeah, I'm just going to stop these milk drinking. Yeah. So Kina, for instance, gives a variety of medical miracles. It's a very large two-tome volume where he has this large... And where you have actually medical doctors who'd rather say, I've been misdiagnosed this patient and I've been mistreating him for the past 20 years, rather than saying it's miraculous that he cured of this incurable spine condition, for instance. So let's now look at the argument for miracles from an externalist perspective. Now, externalism is stronger than internalism. So with internalism, we just have views that cohere well. According to externalism, you're entitled to accept testimony to miracles if they are the result of a reliable testimonial chain. And this is actually for any testimony. So, for instance, if the links in my testimonial chain from the eyewitness to today are reliable, then I'm, in principle, entitled to accept it. And in principle, such long testimonial chains are possible. I mean, they could go on forever. And it's interesting, but actually, if you look at Islam, there is the Hadith. The Hadith is that part of Islamic tradition that is not... so this is not the Quran, but these are sort of oral, transmitted sayings of the Prophet. And the Hadith always consists of the saying itself and the Ijnad. And the Ijnad is basically the testimonial chain that you recite. So you say that this person got it from that person, got it from that person, and so up to the closest companions of Muhammad. And this diagram, I don't know if it's visible, but you see that actually to assess the quality of the Hadith, people look at a lot of these contextual factors. So the reference to a particular authority, the number of reporters involved at each stage of the Ijnad, the links of the Ijnad, are they interrupted or not interrupted, the reliability on the memory of the reporters, and only one of the criteria actually is a content criteria, namely what does actually the Hadith itself say. So all the rest are context. So then we have to wonder, is this testimonial chain for the resurrection sound? And it's interesting, but McGrew, I think, did a great job the past years of trying to resurrect the argument from miracles, and they have this sort of Bayesian approach. And they say, actually, yes, with the New Testament scholarship in hand, we can say that it is reliable. And for instance, they base themselves on New Testament scholarship on this review by Habermas. And Habermas found that actually 75% of New Testament scholars accept the empty tomb. So you have the empty tomb, you have also the testimony to sightings. These people who did this testimony were persecuted, and why would they do that? So they use all sorts of alternative explanations. For instance, that the empty tomb, the first reports are women, and why would women be listed as these are actually not reliable witnesses, or they're not seen as reliable witnesses? So why would gospel writers make something up like that unless it was true? However, as one New Testament scholar put it, there's a bit of a problem with counting noses like that, because there might be other reasons for this widespread agreement, because actually in New Testament scholarship people are quite open to supernatural explanations. And so Allison says as follows: ideology plays such an important role in New Testament scholarships that in principle such conclusions are largely known in advance. So these people already know that they want to come to the idea that the tomb is empty, because as Christians, that's what they believe. And you have Crossley. James Crossley is a secular New Testament scholar. And he says, would another discipline in the humanities seriously consider as historically reliable something as spectacular as someone literally rising from the dead? And yet that's what we do. And he actually calls for more secularism in New Testament scholarship. On the other hand, Keener, for instance, is a New Testament scholar and says supernatural explanations, while not suitable in every case, should be welcome on the scholarly table. So it seems that we can't really get any grasp on how reliable from an externalist point of view these reports are, even given that we have expert agreement. So the data are ambiguous because there are, as Mill said in the beginning of this talk, or rather in the quote of Mill, there are always naturalistic explanations. For instance, interestingly, you have all these sightings in the Gospels of Jesus who walks into the room and so on. But so there have been studies with elderly people and grief visions, and so about 60% of elderly people, I think, is actually really quite a lot. It's a bit frightening. Have grief visions, so see, the deceased loved one at some point. So while it's not incompatible with New Testament miracles, there's also a probability that even, it could be just what Crawford calls a cultural reality, so that these people are making a testimony to, something that they perceived as a reality. So externalism doesn't really get us to the argument for miracles, and internalism doesn't do it either. So I'm going to look at internalist-externalism. This is a position by Alston. Oh, how many? 10 minutes, I'm nearly there. Internalist-externalism says that to be justified in believing that P is for that belief to be based on adequate ground. And that sounds amazingly simple, but actually this is quite a complex position, because what is an adequate ground? So a ground could be, for instance, a perceptual experience, memory, testimony, other beliefs. So these are all different grounds. Adequate could be that it's truth conduciveness of the ground relative to particular beliefs. So for instance, my perception, I believe that you are sitting here right all in front of me. And why do I believe that? Well, why is this adequate? Well, because usually if I form beliefs like that based on my perception, usually they are truth conducive. Interestingly, some people, this view of Alston also entails that two people can have the same belief, but one of them can be adequately grounded, whereas the other one cannot. So for instance, suppose that I see this animal and I form a belief, I see a collie. And that belief is adequately grounded because I know what collie features look like. But there is someone else, let's say a 5-year-old child, who thinks it's a collie, or who says it's a collie. But that child just thinks that any big dog is a collie. Now, the child could have been very easily misled. I mean, so in many other occasions, this belief might have led her to false beliefs, so this ground is not adequate. Yeah, this is just a technical point that the ground, I don't need to be aware that this ground is truth indicative. So let's take, for instance, Zoe, the Christian, with an amateur interest in New Testament scholarship. So why does she believe in the resurrection? Well, she believes in the testimony that she received as a child from her parents in Sunday school during religious education, the coherence of that with other theistic beliefs, and her perusing of some recent books, like Wright's recent book, for instance. Now, the question is this ground sufficiently indicative of truth? So as we have seen, reliance on testimony from parents, school, etc. is usually truth conducive, because if it weren't, we wouldn't do it, because there would be no evolutionary rationale. It might, of course, be in the individual cases, as for instance it could be here, that it might turn out to be false. There might be a defectiveness in first links of the testimonial chain. But interestingly, the internalist-externalist is not concerned with whether or not anything here went wrong in this testimonial chain. You don't need to be concerned about that. You only need to be concerned about whether your particular beliefs are properly grounded. Similarly, she's relying on these New Testament experts, and again, it might be that their judgment is clouded. She doesn't know, she lacks the expertise to judge the expertise of New Testament experts, and as I said, it's not clear if it's mere confirmation bias or a proper openness to supernatural explanations. You can't really gauge that in any non-question-bagging way. So, Zoe's ground lead her to justifiably believe in resurrection, but of course people with different grounds may reach different conclusions. That's the internalist bit. So, for instance, a person who has been raised as an atheist doesn't have this testimonial evidence. A biblical scholar also who disagrees with the majority opinion, like Crossley, doesn't need to defer to his colleague's opinion. So given that the ground will vary between subjects, this cannot be generalized to a compelling argument from miracles. So now come to the quite modest conclusion of this presentation. So I think that the notion of, we looked at these three questions. The first question is the notion of miracle coherent? I think the cognitive science of religion can offer us such an approach where miracles are indeed coherent, namely as something that violate our intuitive expectations, not necessarily nature itself, but just our intuitive expectations of how she will behave. Testimony to miracles need to be acceptable, at least under some conditions. And I've argued that this is the case. Testimony to miracles can be used to argue for particular religious beliefs, and this is probably not, I don't think this is the case. It can perhaps work as a cumulative case, but it doesn't work individually. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Helen. We have up to 25 minutes or so for questions. I'm very grateful if Aku or someone else would take the microphone around. Would we be happy to do that? Thank you very much. If you just wait to ask your question until you get the microphone, then we'll catch that as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Who is gentleman there?
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I work for the Center for Anthropology and Mind on the Cognitive Science of Religion. So I have two things to say about your conclusions, and then one very minor point about Hume. The first is I don't think CSR helps you at all. So it's true that CSR provides a sort of plausible way to describe miracles as sort of violations of intuitive ontology or violations of our psychological intuitions. And it's true that the miracles we care about do correspond to these descriptions. They are violations of, arguably, they are violations of our intuitions. But they are also really improbable events. And the question that Hume raises is, should we believe in really improbable events, regardless of whether or not they are, cognitively violative? So I think, sure, you've sort of redescribed what a miracle is, and it's true that the miracles we care about correspond to these descriptions, but they also correspond to other descriptions, and that's where the problem is. So what you've done is you've changed the topic, and it's not very helpful, I don't think. So I think you're sidestepping the real issue. So the second is this stuff about testimony being acceptable. So I think it's true that you don't need evolutionary psychology. You know, maybe it's nice, but with sort of developmental psychology, it'll tell you that testimony, trusting testimony is useful in many cases. I'm not sure how you go from there to concluding that believing in testimony of miracles is okay, evolutionary speaking or developmentally speaking, because even as you admit, you know, we do monitor our trust and testimony, and we monitor them on the basis of lots of things. For example, how trustworthy, and in fact that's affected by experience, our experience of how trustworthy the source is. But we also monitor our trust and testimony on the basis of our evidence about the world. How likely is it that people, you know, are risen from the dead, and so forth. So I'm not sure that either CSR or the evolutionary psychology of trusting is helpful in either case, which is bad news for you, I think. My minor point on Hume is I don't think Hume should be married to sort of realist conceptions of laws of nature as having sort of exceptionlessness, right? Yeah. So insofar as you're tempted to go there, I mean, I know there is sort of debate over Hume, but Hume's take on laws of nature is not that far away from your pitch on Augustine. I don't know anything about Augustine, but it sounds quite similar. It's sort of imputing subjectivity onto the world to make sense of it. I mean, that's what Hume thinks a law of nature is.
Okay, thank you. So I don't have a writing pad, so I'm trying to remember. So the first thing, so I'm not sure if evolutionary psychology or cognitive science of religion really helped the miracle case. So that is not actually the main aim of this book. The main aim of this book is just to look and see if we can have a fresh perspective on where some intuitions in natural theology come from, and indeed also look at the plausibility of particular arguments. So many of the conclusions I hope that we reach are not known in advance, and that we try to get them as we go there. So I agree with you. I don't know if this particularly helps. So the first thing you state on had just to do with some interpretations of miracles and some interpretations of Hume, in particular Anthony Flew, who said that it's just an incoherent notion. Miracles are incoherent because you have laws of nature and they don't get violated, but then they do get violated and you don't have. So we have to get back to this subjectivist approach. And then exactly so I'm now going to briefly go over to your point about Hume, what Hume exactly meant. So there's like a lot of scholarship that I waded through. So I did say that Hume sees them, it seems to me, the most plausible interpretation as contingently true generalizations, which still makes them improbable. So I do agree that the testimony case, I think, aids in some respects the anti-reductionist view, although it doesn't completely vindicate it, because we're not completely gullible. We do some monitoring. Now, it also does suggest that we don't monitor content that well, because actually a lot of the content that we get is informationally opaque. So a lot of the content, what can we do with it? And so similarly with miracles, they're informationally opaque. We don't know. So I'm not saying that evolutionary psychology gives us any reasons to particularly believe in miracles, but it gives us maybe reasons to accept information as opaque, that we can't verify, and so on. So and that seems to help the miracles case a bit, I think. A little bit, yeah. Yes.
Okay, Steve.
Thanks, Aku. Also on Hume, just a few points. So the first thing is, you seem to present it as if we had to make a choice about subjective account of miracles versus law of nature account. But I'm not seeing why it's a forced choice. We can just have both.
Yeah.
Some uses of the term miracle are meant to be subjective, but others are meant to describe the sort of thing that Hume's on about. Second point, look, in the philosophical literature on miracles, this Flew thing just isn't taken seriously.
No,
It's just not. And the reason is that it makes Hume look like a complete moron. I mean, that he would both suggest that this is what a miracle is. It's, exceptionless generalisation. Oh, but exception, no law of nature, which is what Flew runs with. would just sort of collapse the whole thing immediately. What the word Hume uses is violation, not exception.
Yeah, yeah.
And it looks like he means something like nature has these generalizations which are exceptionless. However, if there's supernatural intervention, then events in the world are changed. But nature itself isn't changed. Nature is still the way it was and goes back to being the way it was when the supernatural intervention stops. So I think the word violation is really important there. Third thing on Hume, I was just a bit surprised that you didn't mention one aspect of Hume on testimony, which is his famous discussion of the passion of surprise and wonder that accompanies miracles.
Yeah,
so what
yeah.
he seems to be suggesting is just that the sort of testimony you get, chains of testimony about miracles, is really biased, because people get so excited about when miracles occur, they tell their friends and they get excited, and you can't rely on that because of the emotional content that accompanies it seems to be the thought. So I'll leave it there, that's probably more than enough.
Yeah. So let me get back, specifically focus on the thing you last said, and let me then see if I can remember all the way to the thing you said in the beginning. So indeed, that passage was particularly interesting because that's actually a passage that started us off into this discussion. So I thought, is it actually the case that because something is surprising, that we will, believe it? Because he says somewhere like that people's, otherwise healthy skepticism gets sort of thrown over by these passions of surprise and wonder which are agreeable. But so, as far as I can see, the Harris studies with the soldier and the sword and that sort of thing shows, if anything, that surprising information, as I said at some point, that people find it, if anything, less likely than more likely. So it's not the case that this is... So this,
but I think his claim is they're more likely to transmit testimony.
Yes, so they're more likely to transmit, but Hume doesn't say that. He says that actually I don't have the miracles text here, but anyway, as far as I remember, he says that we are more likely to believe it, we get carried away. But so we do have to make a distinction between, on the one hand, so I think it's true indeed we're more likely to transmit it. I mean, that's something that actually cognitive science of religion has clearly shown, but has not clearly demonstrated that we find this information at all more credible. So that's, as also I had a brief correspondence with Pascal Boyer about this, did you ever study this sort of stuff? And he said, no, actually I'm not particularly interested in that sort of stuff. And so actually that's a bit of an open question that really deserves more investigation. So wait, then what was your second point?
Just about flu and the exceptions to laws of nature versus violations issue.
Yeah, so indeed, if Hume saw it in the flu way, then why would he talk all about testimony and reliability, etc.? Why didn't he just stop in the beginning? So that's true. So I think indeed it's true that few people would see it as a violation. So, but next to that, the prima facie improbability does go together with a Hume view. So according to Hume, because we have this generalized, we don't know the laws of nature, of course, but we generalize from past experience. And on the basis of that, anything that violates this inductive generalization that we made is a prima facie improbable. So that's why I put it.
It depends what we think the violations are. Are they violations of established laws of nature, or are they violations of the generalizations in our heads that we take to represent laws of nature?
Yeah, so actually Hume builds on the 17th century conception of miracles, and there it's very clear. So the interesting bit is that in the 17th century, these authors like Boyle and Wilkins, they really believed that these were violations of the laws of nature, which we know thanks to scientific inquiry. But of course with Hume you get this weird twist on it because he has this empiricist view. So, yeah.
I mean, he's variously interpreted, isn't he?
Yeah, so... That's, I think, sufficient as.
I could only wish David Hume was here this evening, and then he could tell us what he really thinks.
Yeah, yes.
But since he isn't, and I'll ask you to imagine that he is, and that you're playing the part of David Hume, if I would give you, David Hume, this,
So should I. Okay.
and say to you, if you press these buttons in sequence, you can talk to somebody 1,000 miles away.
Yeah.
Would you be inclined to reject that notion entirely?
Okay,
And
I have
if
just
not-
been transmitted from the 18th century, and I didn't
Yeah,
know anything
yeah,
about mobiles,
Yeah.
right?
And so I assure you, David Hume, if you do as I tell you, you can then talk to somebody 1,000 or more miles away. My question is, how do you suppose David Hume would respond? Because he's holding a miracle in his hand. It transgresses every law of nature that he knows.
Well, this is contrary to inductive probability, but okay, let's test it.
It's like the Indian prince of the ice.
Sorry?
It's an example of the Indian prince.
Yes, yes. He says that the Indian prince is justified, even though in this case he's wrong, right?
The Indian prince refuses to believe
Yeah.
in the solid water.
Yeah, and why shouldn't he? I mean, so that's
The point that I'm making is that the test of miracles is, do they matter? And so many miracles, in fact, you've been discussing a subset of experiences, which is very small subset of experiences. But actually the interesting thing is that people today are far more credulous and skeptical than they have ever been. They accept miracles like this all the time. I remember talking to a very senior physicist quite recently who said, nobody knows how this works. It works. Nobody really knows how it works. It's a miracle.
well, that's really neat. This is the Iliad view. Johan, you remember this better than I do, right? About that we pull a switch and that we sort of magical thinking, right? More than miracles. I mean, we just don't know what the mechanism is, but we presume that there is a mechanism. So people, in this case, I think, defer to scientific authority. They think, I don't know how it works, but there are laws of nature, and it works, well, according to these laws, and it has been, I mean, so they defer to scientific expertise. I think that's how we do it now. And I mean, why wouldn't we? It would just be unmanageable if we wanted to really deeply understand things. And actually, you know, there's a lot of cognitive science studies indicating that people have this very shallow understanding, and they think that they don't. So, for instance, you ask people, could you describe how a helicopter works? And they say, yeah, I can describe it. And you know, on a scale from 0 to 7, how detailed would you? Like 6 or something. And then they actually have to draw the helicopter, and they have no idea how it works. So this is just the shallowness of human knowledge.
I'm a mathematician. I suppose that there is kind of simplification of psychologists in understanding what miracle is. There is complexity of this notion. For example, miracle connected with statistics. During thousands of years, different people from different cultures discovered many times, again and again, the same events. It's statistics. Another argument, human being and human science are very limited. For example, nobody knows what meaning quantum gravity today. And nobody can predict that human science can be successful in discovering what meaning usual gravity is. Because we can have only mathematical equation, but we cannot explain how gravitino, so-called this is kind of very strange, mysterious particle can exist. I suppose that there is limits for human science, and it could be very difficult to predict evolution and development of the science. And I suppose that miracle connects with some kind of human limitness, but God cannot have limitness. And my question is, how can you predict this? How you can explain this kind of complexity of notion of miracle beyond Hume, beyond this kind of psychological micro experiments. This kind of, they have a very strange validation because it's small statistics, only very small representation, only few children's, but you try to make from this kind of experiment very general conclusion, and a very, very
I don't really
skeptical.
understand the question. So, could you try to
The
reformulate?
question is, miracle,
Make it very brief, like a couple of sentences.
miracle is connected with statistics. Statistics, this statistic cannot be reproduced by psychological experiment. Second, there is limitness of human science. This means that there are some events beyond human understanding. And you cannot predict, explain, but you cannot explain.
Yeah, that is. I mean, that would fit very well with the 17th century view of miracles, so that humans are bound in a way by nature that God is not. And I mean, so if you have the current medical literature, as I've
Thousands of years.
Yes, thank you.
yeah. So statistics. So per definition, a miracle is an exceptional event. So how can you statistically predict that? That's part of the problem of having any scientific grasp on is something that medically occurs a miracle or not. So there's just no way you can do that statistically because it's an exceptional, irreproducible event.
All American.
Just hold it a moment. We'll get the microphone.
Sorry.
Are all miracles based only on testimony?
No, you can witness a miracle for yourself. I mean, it depends a bit. I mean, if we take a Tillich-like approach to miracles, then I have witnessed many a miracle. If we take a more restricted view of miracles, let's take the Augustinian, then I don't know, I would have to think. Maybe I've witnessed a miracle, maybe, I don't know. But most of the miracles, and more importantly, the miracles that the argument for miracles is based on, is reliance on testimony. So that's why I discussed so much in detail testimony. But of course there are first-hand miracle experiences, at least in the Tillich sense, and maybe also in the more restricted sense.
So in that large book that you mentioned about medical miracles, are they regarded as reliable, or are they regarded as not?
That is,
medical profession.
so that's the problem with these medical miracles. So what happens is that sometimes you have these things like people have really, like spines that are completely deformed, and then they are no longer deformed, and then so there are quite stringent criteria for looking at these things. But of course, as Mill said in the beginning of this presentation, the Mill quote, it is always possible to come up with some explanation. And what often medical doctors do is they say, we have no explanation for this spontaneous, or they call it spontaneous remission, which is just another fancy term of saying we don't know what happened. So the problem is this is not really a subject of scientific inquiry because they are exceptional, irreproducible, that we have no handle on them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One more question, and then I'll ask a final question. Yes.
It's very interesting to hear your presentation this evening, and I appreciate that for the contribution you're suggesting comes from this new insight, or this very different approach that gives an understanding of miracle. In a sense, are you suggesting that something very extraordinary like that, or that you might define semantically as a miracle, may then open the world up in an extraordinary way for us? We may explain it medically, scientifically, but insofar as we may not even be able to do that as yet. But doesn't that just continue to point us to the boundlessness of reality?
Yeah, so there are basically two ways to go, especially if you have a sort of law-based conception of nature. One of them is that actually if you have a miracle in this sort of law-based sense, that actually, nature is not what we thought it was. I mean, if we remember the neutrino thing that happened earlier this year, or was it late last year? Neutrinos going faster than the speed of light. Okay, well, nobody would say this is a wonderful sign event or something, or maybe some physicists have this sort of view like this is God telling us something. So the interpretation was, when I talked to some physicists after it was not conclusively demonstrated that it was experimental error, they said, we don't know what the hell we're doing. We have to rewrite everything. And that's a sort of one way to go about it, so that nature is not intelligible as we thought it was. And the other way is to say, yeah, well, something happened. But then, I mean, in many cases, there has to be some reasons. I mean, especially from this internalist perspective, there has to be some reasons for God to do what he did. Yeah.
Well, taking it a bit further, I have a little concern, even from a clinical, psychological point of view, which I have is my area, one of my areas of learning, is that where you seem to think that we had to already have a belief in a supernatural to attribute in an experience or to give testimony to that. Because I think it's sometimes the other way around, that we have no belief, but we're open to this boundlessness and almost another dimension of life that would take us into a spiritual, a interpretation that's spiritual.
So I'm not so sure. I think that it's in principle possible that there is a miracle of such magnitude that you're total unbeliever and you come to believe. But as I showed with the Hindu statues miracle, I mean, it was quite well attested, and we're not all converted into Hindus or something like that. And that is like a lot better documented than like the first century resurrection miracle, if anything. So I do think that prior beliefs play a role, and I don't mean that in some bad way. I mean, there's lots of epistemological positions where that's perfectly sensible, that prior beliefs do play a role. So I'm not saying it's in principle impossible, but just unlikely that something like that happens. Yes.
Let's say about physical argument.
Can we just leave that till afterwards? I think we have to finish soon. But I'd like to ask a final question. Thank you. I was particularly fascinated with that film that you showed, and the chimpanzees actually taking a shortcut to get the reward, and the human children actually going through the sort of ritual of that's what it looked like to me, a kind of ritual to get the reward at the end. And you made the point that, objectively speaking, looking over the long term, that there may be a pragmatic case to be made for following that kind of behaviour. It's evolutionarily more successful and so on. I suggest another way of looking at it, which is that there's a very powerful impulse in human beings, and it starts from a very early age, for a union of persons. So it's not just getting the reward that counts. In that particular instance, it's the fact that the child is in fact also engaging in a kind of ritual with the adult there. And it's almost the very similarity of behaviour, doing the same thing in the same way as the adult, which is so powerful. The chimpanzee is not interested. And there's a similar kind of experiment with autistic children, for their relationship is inhibited, their second-person relationship is inhibited. And then they just don't bother to copy the same gestures, just as long as they get the result. So that might be a fruitful line of inquiry. There's this union of persons impulse, which is very strong, and that affects testimony. And it affects testimony, I think, also in miracles.
Yes, thank you very much for that. So I discussed this with Paul Harris, and he says, Michael Tomasello, who has this idea about a second-person perspective as being very important. And so Paul Harris believes that you can't really reduce that completely. He says that it's an important component of testimony, but there is something extra to it. So, for instance, one experiment quite famous is an experiment by Malthoff, where you have this sort of button, and you have a person who pushes a button with his head, and you could actually just put that button with your hand to get you know, whatever it is that they get. And then you have 14-month-old infants, and they push this button with their heads. But then they modified the experiment a bit, where you have, for instance, the hands of the experimenter are occupied. And then the experimenter pushes with the head, and then the child pushes with the hand. So the child realizes the rationale for that. So the ritual thing has to be meaningful somehow. Also, when a child sees another child do it, then it will not copy the other child. So there's not completely reducible to, although it plays an important role, the second-person perspective.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that very thought-provoking talk and the questions afterwards. Just a final notice before we can conclude the evening. We have a last seminar for this term on the 31st of May, and it's a historical-oriented seminar by Dr. Leon Spruit. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, from Nijmegen and Sapienza University. And he's going to be talking about the Catholic censorship of modern science and natural philosophy. And that's going to be based on his study of documents in the Holy Office and on the Index for Forbidden Books. He's been doing a lot of work in the archives in Rome. So 31st of May on the subject of Catholic censorship of modern science and natural philosophy. Thank you very much indeed.